Buenos días. Presento el contexto urbanismo en el Caribe. Necesitamos transformar las desigualdades de género en las comunidades y los espacios urbanos. El estigma social, la violencia contra las mujeres y niñas, la salud menstrual y el poder del espacio patriarcales son problemas del desarrollo urbano. It is a pleasure to have the opportunity to deliver this presentation to the 13th Caribbean Urban Forum at the Pontificia Universidad, Católica, Madre y Maestra in Dominican Republic. Today, I will discuss the state-led Latrine Eradication program facilitated in an urban development public agency in Trinidad and Tobago from a gender perspective. In a moment when international development agencies and multilateral banks have created guidelines for the inclusion of gender as a category of analysis and planning, the implementation of these projects and the extent to which they are gender responsive in their design have significant gaps. For this reason, the aim of this presentation is to solicit feedback on leading practices on mainstreaming gender equality in urban planning projects in the Caribbean. I also advocate for enhanced investment in redressing sanitation poverty throughout the region. The connections between latrines, health and environmental risk, social stigma, and informal settlement, or as my colleague said, self-built communities, are known by all in attendance here. What can we do further to effectively plan and advance sustainable sanitation systems and toilet culture in the Caribbean? Finally, I invite you, distinguished urban planners and policymakers in the development space, to imagine an urban planning practice that is decolonial and depatriarchal. But this does not stop with the profession alone. We can imagine a decolonial and depatriarchal future for Caribbean people where the values of gender, social, and spatial justice form part of our everyday lives. Sanitation poverty refers to a lack of adequate sanitation infrastructure and services necessary to access essential sanitation for individual and communal health and well-being. In high-density urban settings, a latrine puts people at a special risk to adverse health outcomes, contamination of ground and surface water networks, and experiences of gender-based violence, particularly sexual violence. Toilets and bathrooms may not be constructed in self-built communities due to the cost of amenities, plumbing services, and the absence of basic utilities such as water and electricity. In my field interviews, I learned that people with latrines spend significantly more time managing their bodies, labor, and health. This includes doing some form of bowel control, time loss for work, and even social issues, such as the perception of unfitness of a living environment for a co-parent who hopes to accommodate their child in the household and cannot due to poor household and sanitation infrastructure. Notably, the proliferation of self-built communities and latrines have been part of colonial life, as working class people form communities on the periphery of capital and metropolitan areas, many of whom were subject to exploitation by landlords who were also the regulators of that area. These people were considered dirty, unclean, nasty, and living outside of modernity. Latrines, therefore, became a symbolic and physical marker for life in the slums, which were very much implicated in the discourses and policies of slum clearance in the early 20th century. The legacies of colonial planning and urban spaces, specifically European obsession, investment, and audacity to define, correct, and order non-European spaces, informed its technocracy, top-down, racialized, and class-based spatial reordering, often through violence and force. These historical antecedents are key to understanding the context in which latrine eradication programs and sanitation poverty takes place today. The methodology of my research, which is part of a larger research project, is institutional ethnography. While I will not discuss the inner workings and processes of the specific public agency I studied, in this presentation I would like to acknowledge the utility of this approach to urban planning. Institutional ethnography is rooted in feminist sociology. It was advanced by Dorothy E. Smith, the pioneering British-born Canadian-based scholar who sought to explore social relations that structure people's everyday lives, how ordinary and mundane activities become sites of investigation. The study of client-institutional relationships, examination of decision-making processes, and inclusion of gender analysis make institutional ethnography a generative method. For example, it helps us understand the gaps between physical development plans and the process of project selection in one fiscal year. It can explain the ways that incident reports by project supervisors illustrate labor conflicts on construction sites or conceal unsafe work practices. Institutional ethnography can examine feedback, formal and informal, and assess the ways they are included, discarded, or rendered as complaints in the office when projects are implemented. With an analysis of archival data, reports, joint select committee submissions, alongside ethnographic note-taking, while walking in the field, I was able to identify the ways in which gender inequalities are rendered invisible in urban planning through the Latrine Eradication program. Before I provide context on the proliferation of latrines in the world, I recognize that pit latrines are a basic form of improved sanitation and separate from open defecation. According to UNICEF, since 2000, as many as 545 million people use pit latrines or bucket latrines. Global data on toilet facilities are not readily available, but it is evident that global south regions, namely sub-Saharan Africa and Southern Asia, are the most affected by this. Some countries, such as South Africa, implement a bucket eradication program to improve public health and eradicate poor sanitation structures. However, India, since 2014, has initiated the most comprehensive sanitation campaign in the 21st century to eliminate defecation and improve solid waste management. The Swachh Bharat Abhiyan Clean India mission accelerated India's drive to meet UN Sustainable Development Goal 6.2 on ending open defecation and paying special attention to the needs of women and girls and those in vulnerable situations. By 2019, India's campaign delivered over 100 million toilets, benefiting 500 million people across 630,000 villages. In Trinidad and Tobago, latrine eradication programs are implemented through two public agencies, the Ministry of Housing and Urban Development and the Ministry of Local Government and Rural Development. The geographic focus of this discussion is on East Port of Spain, Trinidad and Tobago. East Port of Spain is part of the Greater Port of Spain metropolitan area and extends over 2,700 hectares of land. 19 urban villages were identified, which include communities such as Lavantil, Belmont, Sealots, Mova, and Beetham Gardens. To reduce the area to a concrete jungle, as Bob Marley sang so profoundly of urban whalers, would be to misrepresent the space. The population housing census notes that the accessibility of sanitation infrastructure in households is an issue. And it has an agrarian character. There are hills in East Port of Spain, there are flatlands in East Port of Spain, there are coastal territories as well in East Port of Spain. The 2010-2011 census revealed that up to 2,621 households in East Port of Spain use pit latrines for the disposal of sewage. Though the national census is scheduled to be rolled out in 2024, the absence of relevant data on pit latrines obscure baseline studies, contextualization, and claims to the effectiveness of state programs. To move quickly into the themes I'd like to address, there have been key gender issues in the latrine eradication program that are insightful for regional planners. It shows that there is greater need for gender-responsive urban architecture, design, and policy. First, social stigma and shame. One of the principal sites of gender inequalities is the reproduction of shame and social stigma on people who use latrines. Children, subject to ridicule and class-based insults by other working-class children, are the ones who are most affected. In school, they may be referred to as latrine children. They may also have challenges with operating flush toilets in public settings. This point shows that there is a psychosocial dimension to poverty that is very much part of our planning. Handovers for toilets, therefore, or bathrooms would benefit from sensitization for behavior change, and that must be accounted for financially. Then we have the risk to gender-based violence, especially women and girls. Girls and women's experiences of sexual violence, voyeurism, harassment, sexual assault and latrines are underreported. Women express fears using the bathrooms at night, sometimes request accompaniment by male relatives, and lost time when managing shower times, especially in yards with pedestrian tracks or multi-unit properties of people outside of the family. This issue already challenges the construction dilemma of building a toilet and a bath outside with an improved structure in a risky environment, or attempting to build an adjoining toilet and bath to a house with a weak physical structure. The third issue is period poverty. Sanitation poverty and the exposure from latrines present a number of challenges to menstrual hygiene and health management. Period poverty involves more than the access to sanitary pads, but quality sanitation infrastructure and services. Taboos around menstruation are prevalent in the Caribbean. Pad access and disposal, as well as the introduction of toilet facilities, are key ingredients to menstrual equity. In response to this, the Office of the Prime Minister has identified latrine eradication as part of the larger national drive to end period poverty. And the last point, which I could discuss further in the question and answer, would be masculinity in the construction sector. I'm prepared to discuss in further detail the way construction reifies masculinity, male workers, male contractors, and androcentric building, which excludes women's needs and interests. If planners do not identify the unequal gender division of labor in the construction sector and community dynamics, they are predisposed to reproducing patriarchal power relations of space and living. So in order to redress these gender inequalities, mainstreaming gender equality in urban planning and development is fundamental. Gender mainstreaming is an instrument for equal social and spatial planning and design for all women and men. It also recognizes that construction programs are fundamentally social. They can be developed to transform unequal gender norms that contain and prescribe the equal participation of women and men. As part of a modest proposal, I encourage you to consider gender-responsive urban planning. In 2022, the UN Women launched a Caribbean model for resilient, inclusive, smart, and safe cities, the RISC model. It was developed as part of the Enabling Gender-Responsive Disaster Recovery, Climate, and Environmental Resilience in the Caribbean project. I also propose the use of gender-responsive budgeting as a tool for urban planners and developers to adequately account for the financial dimensions of funding gender-responsive programs and projects. Again, we can discuss this in more detail subsequently. As I close, I ask you to reflect on the extent to which you lead urban planning in the Caribbean with a gender perspective. Now it is time for us to socialize construction in the Caribbean by appreciating that public infrastructure forms a critical dimension of our people infrastructure, the social infrastructure. There is need for further advocacy on sanitation poverty in the Caribbean to improve health outcomes, promote menstrual equity, and refocus public health agenda in urbanism. Last, I ask you to reflect on your politics of urban planning. Do we continue the coloniality of urban planning and development, or do we make intentional and independent-minded breaks? This, of course, is implied in the post-independent Caribbean state practice, but it is a question we are tasked with continually returning to. In spite of our macro-level environmental planning, development has been projectized in the Caribbean region, which perhaps is a function of the scarcity of resources. This was made abundantly clear with national physical plans discussed during this week. Plans stress one-year deliverables and easily achievable tasks. Financial releases for planning are not tiered, and project completion percentages often reflect the under-mobilization of public funds and poorly staffed public agencies. This projectization of development is in direct conflict with the ethos of urban planning. Perhaps we can benefit not from looking at the bigger picture, but the smaller one. See spaces as multi-scalar networks for community planning. In practice, Caribbean planning is multi-scalar, multi-directional, and iterative. In bacchanal terms, Macro environmental urban design is more of a wet dream than a wife or a husband. What we have are flexible, small, or they like that, I was sounding too bright. In bacchanal terms, macro environmental urban design is more of a wet dream than a wife or a husband. What we have are flexible, small and medium-sized projects from a small fiscal resource pool when we discuss urban planning at lower level public agencies. Still, gender equality is a core principle for urban planning. I have worked at the program and project level. There is room to scale this up to planning throughout all our processes. Thank you.